Problem.
I think you can start now, Weber.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. I welcome you all to the 8th Ram Bapat Memorial Lecture. Both the organizers of this lecture series, Mr. Gajanan Paranspe and Makran Sathe, are with us, and our speaker, Soumyabrata Chaudhary. So I now invite Gajanan Paranspe to take over. He'll speak in Marathi and he'll talk briefly about the speaker and today's lecture.
माझा आवाज ऐकू येतोय? नमस्कार. जुलै 2013 ते जुलै 2019 या गेल्या 7 वर्षामध्ये आपण सगळ्यांनी मिळून प्रत्यक्ष सभागृहामध्ये उपस्थित राहून प्राध्यापक राम बापट स्मृती व्याख्यानमालेमध्ये विविध वक्त्यांनी गुंफलेले विचार ऐकण्याचा आनंद घेतला. जुलै 2020 मध्ये या व्याख्यानमालेत 8वं पुष्प गुंफण्यामध्ये अडथळा आला. तो कोरोना संकटामुळे आला. आज जुलै 2021 मध्ये या संकेतस्थळाच्या माध्यमातून का होईना आपण भेटतो आणि या व्याख्यानमालेतलं 8वं पुष्प गुंफलं जातंय याचा मनापासून आनंद होतो. या वर्षीचं व्याख्यान देणार आहे माननीय बुद्धिवंत अध्यापक, रंगकर्मी आणि प्रसिद्ध लेखक श्रीयुत सौम्यव्रत चौधरी. त्यांच्या व्याख्यानाचा विषय आहे प्लेगचे प्रसंग ते महामारीचे नियम, रंगभूमी आणि रोग प्रतिकार शक्ती यांच्या बखरीतील काही अंश. फ्रॉम द सीन्स ऑफ ए प्लेग टू प्रिस्क्रिप्शन्स फॉर अ पॅन्डेमिक, ग्लिम्सेस फ्रॉम द क्रॉनिकल्स ऑफ थिएटर अँड इम्युनिटी. आणि हे व्याख्यान इंग्रजी भाषेतून होणार आहे याची नोंद कृपया आपण सर्वांनी घ्यावी ही विनंती आहे. समाजामधल्या विविध घटकांच्या मध्ये देवाणघेवाण करू पाहणाऱ्या उपक्रमांना प्राज फाउंडेशनच्या संचालिका श्रीमती परिमल चौधरी यांची मदत होत असते. ही व्याख्यानं मला कार्यान्वित करण्यासाठी त्याच्या आयोजन नियोजन प्रक्रियेमध्ये आतापर्यंत प्राज फाउंडेशनचं अर्थपूर्ण सहकार्य लाभलेलं आहे. साधना साप्ताहिक, पाक्षिक परिवर्तनाचा वाटसरू, मासिक आंदोलन शाश्वत विकासासाठी, सर्व मराठी आणि इंग्रजी वृत्तपत्र, त्यांचे संपादक, वार्ता प्रतिनिधी, ऑल इंडिया रेडिओ पुणे स्टेशन, संदीप देशपांडे, वैभव आपनावे, अनुपम बर्वे, अनुष्का गोखले, आपण सगळे उपस्थित बापटसर प्रेमी जन, तसंच ज्ञात अथवा अज्ञात व्यक्ती, संस्था अशा सर्वांचं सहकार्य लाभलेलं आहे. त्या सर्वांचे मी मनापासून आभार मानतो. सर्वांना मनापासून धन्यवाद देतो. आता श्री मकरन साठे यांना मी विनंती करतो की त्यांनी प्राध्यापक राम बापट स्मृती व्याख्यानमाला सुरू करण्याबाबतची भूमिका मांडावी आणि त्यानंतर आजचे आपले प्रमुख वक्ते श्रीयुत सौम्यव्रत चौधरी यांचा परिचय करून द्यावा. Now, I request to Mr. Makaran Sathe that kindly brief the function of installing this memorial lecture series and then to introduce our honorable speaker, Mr. Soumyabrata Chaudhary. Mr. Makaran Sathe, please continue.
Thank you, Gajanan. And thank you everybody for joining in. This is the 8th year, so I actually need not elaborate on Ram Bapat or the lecture series, but this is the first time that we are going on internet. So I expect many new faces amongst the audience. So I will be very brief and try to introduce Professor Ram Bapat to those who did not know him, unfortunately, or those who did not know about this series. I will be as brief as possible. Professor Ram Bapat was an extraordinary intellectual who expired in July 2012. My association with him, and as well as Gajanan's probably, was more than 30 years. I gained, through his association, I gained so much that I can't even speak about it. And there are hundreds of me, and like Gajanan, from every field of life, from political and social workers to artists, from politicians to writers and playwrights, from intellectuals to students. Nobody was barred from his company. He was by training a political scientist, but he was a versatile genius in the true sense of the term. So he was versatile in sociology, philosophy, art, literature, theater. I can go on naming the fields in which he had great insights to offer, and he always offered them absolutely freely to anybody who approached him. Many who are capable of, there are many intellectuals who are capable of critical thinking and analysis. Bapat was obviously very good analyst and critical thinker, but in addition to that, he was a very good, he was very good at synthesizing the thought also. We talk so many times about divisions in the society. When we do that, we talk mainly about economic divisions, social divisions, caste divisions, gender divisions, etc. There is one more division in the society which is increasing and widening, and which is equally important, that that between common people, political leaders, political workers, and thinkers, or social scientists. And this all these gaps, Bapat single-handedly tried to bridge all these gaps throughout his the life. Unfortunately, people like me or Gajanan do not have the capacity to do this work the way Bapat did. So what we did was that instead of doing that job, we installed a lecture series by which we invite people from different fields of life, and but those people who have as wide a worldview as Bapat had, and as deep an understanding and critical thinking capacity as Bapat had. We have been very lucky to have Praj Foundation, who has been supporting us for last 8 years, and Parimal Chaudhary. I just had to give her one phone call 10 years back, and she said, yes, we are going ahead with it. Just name what you need, and I will give you. She has really participated even in organizing the function, not only funding it. There were three major concerns of Bapat. That is social, the political, and the creative. We request every speaker to give a lecture, choose a topic which would stand on this tripod of social, political, and creative. And that's the only restrictions or only request that we may make of the speakers. And they're left to, they're free to choose the topic they are going to speak. Now, I won't repeat who all spoke on this platform in the past, as all these lectures are available on YouTube, free for everybody to see. This year, we have been very lucky to get Soumyabrata Chaudhary, who accepted again by just one phone call, and he accepted to give a lecture here. I'm extremely thankful to him. I will introduce him in very short. Soumyabrata Chaudhary teaches at the School of Arts and Aesthetics, Jawaharlal Nehru University. He has authored several essays on ancient Greek liturgy, the staging of Ibsen, psychoanalysis, Nietzsche, Ambedkar, Phule, Schiller, and Hegel. Chaudhary is the author of Theatre, Number, Event 3 Studies on the Relationship Between Sovereignty, Power, and Truth, which was published by Indian Institute of Advanced Studies in 2013. Ambedkar and Other Immortals, an Untouchable Research Program, published by Navayanana in 2018. And now it's come to the essence, Notes on Coronavirus and Shaheen Bagh, Association and Isolation, again Navayana 2020. Professor Chaudhary will be speaking on the topic From the Scenes of a Plague to Prescription for a Pandemic, Glimpses from the Chronicles of Theatre and Immunity. Thank you all for sharing, for signing in for this lecture. I'm sure you are in for a wonderful treat. I now invite Professor Soumyabrata Chaudhary to deliver his lecture. Sir, the platform is yours.
Thank you very much for this extraordinary opportunity to speak at this commemorative series dedicated to the memory of Ram Bapat. I have to thank Makran Sate to begin with for extending this invitation and being very generous with his discussions with me on the phone, like he mentioned, about what to speak on and what would be an interesting or relevant subject to speak on. And he left this choice entirely to my discretion and freedom. It is despite the fact that I was really hoping that he would make it easier for me and suggest something very, very specific, but he left it to me to choose a topic. So I thank him for this wonderful generosity. Gajanan Paranjpe, who is also someone I met only briefly a couple of years back when I met him at Pune, but I was moved by his frank friendship, even if it was very brief at that time. That he's here today as part of the organizing team is something I am really happy about, to have him near me. Vaibhav and Anushka, who are here again, and they have been constant partners in a kind of intellectual and also an improvised informal discussion about our times as they are making us even with each day more and more bewildered and challenging us with more and more demands of thinking in our times between the last 2 years in particular. Their presence. Devjyoti, my student here who is right in this room, right here, physically, without whom, again, organizing this wouldn't be possible from between Delhi and Pune. Also for being part of this circle of discussion. So I really value his contributions to my ideas. So these are some among many others who deserve my acknowledgement, and I hope they'll recognize themselves in what I say in the next hour or so, for the next hours. But I also wanted to say that while I did not know Ram Bapat personally, having heard about him from Makran and the others, and also having read about him in a small piece by Mangesh Kulkarni recently, I was really stimulated and moved by the fact that he was somebody who Makran in a previous conversation described as a kind of Socrates, a kind of Socrates of the place that Pune is. I find that characterization to be extremely interesting because Socrates was someone who lived in a town or a city at that time, in the city Athens. But his presence in the city was something which could not be reduced to any particular professional occupation or site. So he was not a professional scholar or professor. He was not somebody who belonged to any trade. He was not also a professional artist. And yet, like Macron just mentioned, he was someone who made it possible for all of these so-called social and artistic and civic roles in the city of Athens to circulate amongst themselves, to become part of a larger encounter that the physical space of the city became. So I imagine Ram Bapat was one of such rare agents of the city of Pune, the place that Pune is, to become also not just a physical place, but a site of several encounters beyond professional, civic, social, or institutional roles. And that imagination, it seems to me, is very relevant for also our discussion for today, because after all, it is in this place called Pune that today we find, among, of course, many other places, one of the most marked sites of something else, not artistic, not philosophical, not political, but something that we know by an epidemiological term, a biological term, which is the circulation of a virus, a particular pathogenic agent, which creates an effect which is the opposite of what the imagination of a Socrates in Athens or a Ram Bapat in Pune evokes. Not the effect then of a city present to itself in all its philosophical, cultural, and artistic vitality, but a city emptied out, a city locked down, a city which has to suspend its essential presence to itself. So if I were to characterize Pune as one of the several theater cities, not just of our country, but of the world, one of the most important theater cities of the world, and that is a different discussion which we can, actually demonstrate through the history of theater in Pune. But theater city in that specific sense of being present to yourself in the very creation, in the very encounter of art, between people and art. An art that is created by people and people encounter that very art in that space as a living space of mutual transformation. Then, what does it mean for such a city, such a place, to empty itself out? A theater city to suspend its very essential theatrical life? That is the question, which I want to start by posing to you. If the life of theater is hollowed out from the space of a city, then does the city itself lose its essential force of character, its essential color? Or is it that in being suspended as a theater city, as a theater which desires the encounter, as a city which desires the encounter with the theater, in that very suspension, desire still lives on. The desire for art, the desire for this collective artistic and civic transformation, social transformation, an existential transformation lives on, but lives on in such a way that it cannot anymore be present in the sense that a play is present to its audience in the auditorium, that a performance is present to its spectators, a reading of a poem, of a story, is present to its listeners. Is it possible to think of desire as something which can be affirmed, which can be said to exist not in its production of work, whether that be the work of theater performances, or that be a painting, or that be literary work, a book, and so on and so forth, but in its very suspension? That is the question that I would eventually want to ask today. And all in honor of this fantastic image that I have, been led to create through what Makaran, Gajanan, Vaibhav, Anushka, everyone else has told me, and also what I've read about Ram Bapat. But then let me start with this fact that this question of a theater city actually is something which is not limited only to some of the historical references that we have to such unique places as Athens in 500 BC or Pune in the last 100 years. The idea of a theater city, which itself is in some sort of biological crisis, some sort of a medical crisis, is something which has been evoked in the history of drama from the very beginning. For instance, in the Greek tragedy, the Greek tragic play Oedipus, the play starts with a plague. The play starts when a chorus of Theban, the city there is the Greek city of Thebes. Theban citizens, chorus of Theban elders, they address the king, who is Oedipus, with the lament that their city is going through a terrible plague. There are bodies everywhere. Women are not being able to give birth to living children. The entire city is shriveled up. Nature has also completely lost its vitality. There is only the scent of death in the city. And under the weight of this terrible experience, the elders appeal to King Oedipus that you are our greatest. You save the city. You do something which will eventually bring redemption to us, which will save us. So it is with this lament that the Greek play Oedipus starts. And of course, then Oedipus replies with a certain promise, and what happens after that is something else which I don't have to go into. But this is something which is present at the very dawn of the history of theater writing, the history of tragedy. But what is interesting about this example of Oedipus is that, and that is what I want to point towards, is that it is not the first plague in the city of Thebes. When at the beginning of the play, the chorus comes and appeals to King Oedipus to save them from this plague. There is an earlier plague, which is actually there in the play, which comes out, of course, during the unfolding of the plot of the play. When we learn around the middle of the play that actually Oedipus became the king of Thebes only when there was an earlier plague, and again the same experience was being wrought upon the people of that city. There was death and devastation everywhere. And then Oedipus was actually a foreigner, was an immigrant. He came along and he found out that this plague was apparently caused by the presence of a monster sitting outside the precincts, the borders of this city called Thebes, and asking a question, asking something which was a riddle, an intellectual problem, almost a philosophical one, which this monster, which was called Sphinx, challenged the city with. If you are able to solve this intellectual puzzle, then I will let you go and your city will be freed of the plague. So this is an extraordinary context in which the origins or the genesis of the plague does not lie in a biological or a viral origin or a viral source, but it lies in something like an intellectual deficiency, something like a challenge to thought. And Oedipus, who was an immigrant, he came along and solved the problem and killed the Sphinx and freed the city of its suffering, and hence the city chose him to become the king. So in a sense, we are not just looking at one city which in its localized autonomous existence suffers something so terrible as the plague, but we are also looking at a city which is constituted by the presence of immigrants and foreigners who peculiarly also bring to it, in a moment of crisis, a new knowledge, a new intellectual possibility. So this is the challenge that I want to start with today, which might seem almost absurd to us in the context of a scientific material reality that we are, as a kind of living history of science experiencing, that is the materiality of the virus, the coronavirus today. Nevertheless, it seems to me that the accompanying intellectual challenge remains as real and as much relevant to our powers of addressing it through thought as it was in the myths and tragedies of ancient Greece. Because after all, even within this living history of science that we find ourselves plunged into today, we are being asked a question which is what could be called a total question, a complete question, because the Sphinx asked the Thebans a complete question, the answer to which was not a policy answer, the answer to which was not a technological answer, but eventually a simple answer. Because the answer to that question, whatever that question was man, the generic universal human being as such. It was the simplest answer which somehow eluded and evaded the thinking capacities of everyone there. And Oedipus came along, a foreigner, an immigrant, who did not belong to any of the civic and professional roles that the city had already assigned to its so-called citizens. And the immigrant with no place in the city saved the city by thinking on its behalf. So, do we have a total question today when it's so clearly a specific, a localized material problem that we are facing, to which we again and again appeal to science to come to our epistemic rescue? Science to provide the knowledge to answer that question. But is there a total question underlying this scientific question, the specific question? Is there a question which is, how should one put it, the question of science itself, not just the scientific answer to a biological question, to a question of nature, but the question of science itself? And it seems to me that we are asking that question all the time, even if we are not doing it consciously. So for instance, we are always worried about the fact that human beings themselves have partly caused the conditions in which such a virus can cause such devastation on a global scale. We have constantly whipped ourselves with the historical reality that we have created a global world without being able to protect that very world from forces which we have created, but we have created, like kind of Frankenstein, something that is beyond our control. One very striking example of that is, of course, the real force and fact of climate change. And that is being very importantly linked with our present crisis and our present suffering today, from which a whole lot of ethical prescriptions are being issued, so that we wonder if it will be possible to change our way of life, our forms of life, to live a more ethically responsible life once we are through this pandemic. So we are not, it is not as if we are not asking the total question of ourselves, of the human being as a social being. But at the same time, it seems to me, and that is my worry, if not an active complaint, that even while we are asking this fundamental total question, as I call it, of ourselves, we are impatient with thinking too much in a time of crisis. Particularly in our part of the world, in our society, Indian society, it seems to me, over the last 1.5, 2 years, again and again, we have, even at the very cusp, even at the very threshold of asking this fundamental question, we have abandoned the question and left it to technocrats and left it to the so-called experts to, in a sense, do it for us, to prescribe the right prescriptions for us, which we are happy to follow. Or we do not follow well enough, such that we can then whip ourselves again, particularly through the media, that look, we are acting irresponsibly. We are again causing damage to ourselves. And yet we are not asking the questions, who is this we? Who is involved in this sort of a contradictory historical situation? When apparently we know what is good for us and we do not know what is good for us. When apparently we have the power to, in a sense, master our difficulties, our crisis, with our technologies, with our apparatuses. And yet, we are constantly diagnosing our own culpability in letting these very technologies and apparatuses create a world, a planet, which is inexorably moving towards destruction. So, the Sphinx question, at the dawn of the history of theater, who are we? What is it that we are? Is our question. And yet, it seems we are too much in a hurry, or we are too paralyzed to ask it. Now, I'm not saying that I am capable of addressing such a large and such a concrete question, to which eventually the simplest and the most shattering of answers we will have to have the courage to confront. I'm not saying I'm that one and that person. And yet, insofar as today I am so fortunate as to be in this peculiar situation of looking at a flat screen, and yet, in a sense, also committing myself to your presence, to a virtual presence beyond the screen, which is a real presence, which is not simply a so-called digital presence, but a real presence, a concrete presence to you and all of you. Not just a collection of names and personalities, but all to all. Insofar as I commit myself to that form of addressing, I would like to, in very simple terms, return to such a question. What is this historical situation or point where we must and we are led to ask the question, what kind of historical beings are we, who are today, beyond our own control, placed in this situation, which we call, in a simple English word, crisis situation, emergency or crisis. So having started having started with this fundamental question, I would like to suggest that the question of history itself must be posed in its concrete, even empirical terms, which, in the case of our present situation, is not simply a history of science in the largest sense, that is the history of the biological sciences, but a very specific modality of the biological sciences, which to some people might seem unlikely or even meaningless, but I'll still suggest that is the case, which is the history of language. There is a history of language implicated, in which we are implicated in our present situation. And that is experienced with even more vehemence today, because of the nature of our media, which surrounds us with certain words, with certain codifications, certain linguistic reminders that this is the world we live in today. So what are these words? Now, of course, the word which is uppermost in this cascade of, linguistic effects of language, is the very word pandemic. Now, I will not undertake a kind of philological or even a semantic analysis of these words, though it seems to me that such a new dictionary of words should be attempted. The words, our words, the words that we not merely use, but the words that we are in our historical situation. So one such word is the word pandemic. Now, the word plague, in relation to the word pandemic, has a history or a historical relationship which is at one level extremely simple, which is that the plague is an earlier word for an epidemic which eventually reaches a certain threshold of global consciousness, of global institutional consciousness, that we call the consciousness of a global epidemic or a pandemic. And the earlier name for that is a plague. But at the same time, if we look at the documents of history, then we see that the word plague is has multiple meanings. It is polysemous. While the word pandemic is a word closer to our present day scientific consciousness. On the one hand, the word plague, belongs to the domain of science. So there are, for instance, in early 20th century, international plague commissions and plague conferences. Even in the late 19th century, plague is part of a very clear scientific investigation on the relationship between the transmission of contagious diseases between animal and man, from animal to man. And technically, this is also called zoonosis, a zoonotic origin of a plague, or a plague as being of zoonotic origin, spreading from animals to human beings. And this scientific investigation is backed up by a huge amount of epidemic research, which also consists of ethnographic research. So we read in certain documents that, for instance, just as a brief example, in early 1910-11, around that time, because of the spread of plague-like situation or symptoms in Mongolia, sorry, not in Mongolia, in Manchuria, on the border of China and Russia, there was a kind of coming together of Chinese and Russian and eventually Japanese scientists, where a debate took place about the origins of the plague at that time, whether the plague was caused by a certain furry animal called the marmot, the Siberian marmot, which the local people used to hunt. It is also, this animal is called something like Tarbagus. So this was called the Tarbagian hypothesis at that time. Or was the more standard hypothesis of plagues being fundamentally linked to rats, in which certain researchers from India were also relevant. So there was a debate about the kind of hypothesis that has to be taken seriously in the history of science in a particular ethnographic context, which is the context of a plague that is taking place at that time, in early 1910, 1911, when one of the first plague conferences takes place at the end of the plague in 1911, where Japanese scientists take the position of the standard hypothesis. They commit themselves to the standard hypothesis of rats being the origins of the plague, while the Chinese scientists, or the main head of that scientific team, he goes along with the Russian scientists and says that it is actually something which was caused by the local animal, which is a Siberian marmot, to which is joined, and that is very interesting, the possibility of a kind of local indigenous knowledge of the plague, which standard global scientific developments did not take seriously from then to now. But at the same time, there is nothing here to guarantee that there was a superior indigenous knowledge of the plague either. The point is that there was a living debate that was happening on the very site of a terrible plague, which at that time had caused almost 100% mortality of a certain region through that plague. So this is just a brief example of the fact that on the one hand, the word plague has a very strong scientific meaning, even if that meaning is not totally clear. It is part of a whole series of scientific debates, but it is situated within the climate of a living history of science at that time. But it is exactly around this period, probably going back, and it does go back to the medieval times, but let me just for the moment cite examples from late 19th to early 20th century, where the word plague is used in a very different way in literature, where a tremendous amount of metaphorical energy is invested into the word plague. So, for example, Edgar Allan Poe, the American writer, writes a story called The Red Death. And in this story, we see a protagonist called Prince Prospero, who has, in the time of a plague, fortified himself. He lives in a fort, in a castle, which is completely fortified. In today's language, he's locked himself down and totally distanced himself from everyone else in society, except for his retinue and, of course, the guards who guard that fort. So in a sense, the guards are the go-betweens, the only surface of contact between the possible source of the plague and these human beings who are protected within this fort. And after 6 months or so, when the Prince Prospero is happy with the fact that none of them have got infected, 6 months of lockdown, he wants to celebrate this accomplishment, and he organizes a party, a celebratory masque. So probably the name of the story is not the Red Death, but the Masque of the Red Death or something like that. Masque here to be understood, the English word with a Q. That is a masked ball, a costume party, basically. And a costume party where only the people who live within that fort are invited for this celebration. So again, it is as if there is strict distancing which is being observed to protect oneself from any kind of contact with anyone from outside. And yet, at a certain moment, and this is the beauty and the horror of Poe's fiction, at a certain moment, when they're all dancing with each other, we see the Red Death having incarnated itself as one person in the party, as one dancing figure in the party. The Red Death itself having entered the party as part of the party. So the virus has entered the party not out of biological contact, not out of contagion, but out of something else. Out of something which is this very vulnerability of the human being to at some point let go of his immunitarian discipline, of something which at that time could be called his temptation and his desire for something like a sensuous contact, which a dance is. Even if that sensuous contact is a contact being immunized against anything foreign, nevertheless, once you've opened yourself up to sensuous contact, to erotic contact, to desire, you have already opened yourself up to something foreign, not necessarily which is a foreign organism, a pathogenic foreignness, but a foreignness within you, something which is eventually going to be called in another text a psychic entity, which the virus is, which is not a virus, but a psychic entity which is our own vulnerability to falling into corruption, or falling into temptation, falling into indiscipline, falling into errancy. After all, why did Prince Prospero call out for that party? Because at some point, Prince Prospero had to exercise his freedom, even though it was his freedom which had asked him to fortify himself, to immunize himself. And it was his freedom that asked him to go back to sensuous contact. It is this errancy of freedom which, in Poe's story, becomes a mark of something like the return of the virus. though not a virus at all. He calls it simply the Red Death, who is dancing among all the other human beings, having, through a fictional transfiguration, gained the figure of a human being, but not a human being, but the foreignness which resides in human society, the dangerous foreignness. It is in another text in the 1930s that we find something even more direct and shattering, but of this same nature. And this text is by Antonin Artaud, the French theater writer, actor, painter, madman. And I mean this literally, because he had spent a large part of his adult life in lunatic asylums. Antonin Artaud wrote a text called Theatre and the Plague, in which, again, he asserted that the plague is caused not by contact with the animal. He mentioned the rat, the black rat. It is not caused through an animal and then eventually contact between, the virus-carrying bodies, human bodies or rat bodies or any other kinds of bodies. He called it a psychic entity. He said the origins of the plague, the genesis of the plague, is in something psychic. And this becomes extremely mystical, to the point that one is irritated, not just irritated, but angry, that when this thing happens for real, like it is now, then how can we waste time with such hocus pocus? At the same time, when you read a text like Artaud's Theatre and the Plague, you also realize that what he's getting at is not really an issue of scientific or a critique of scientific history, anything like that. Nothing to do with alternative traditions of medical science, allopathic versus homeopathic versus anything else, Ayurvedic, Unani. All of those references are there because, after all, Artaud calls the virus an oriental virus. There are all these extremely problematical and exalted metaphoric references. But at the very core, what Artaud is saying, and I want to really reach that core today quickly, is that what happens in a plague is social. What happens during the plague, its symptoms are civic and social. He brings the plague down to an experience of space, the space of the city, the space of that place. Athens, Pune, any other. In his own text, he's thinking of, because he's thinking of a plague of the 18th century. And he's referring to towns in France, Bordeaux, and other towns, where there is, on the one hand, movement of ships, for instance, going from one town to the other, apparently bringing the plague along with them. But at the same time, Artaud again and again shows, or tries to show, that the plague spreads despite other kind of instances where there is no contact. There is no conceivable contact. And that's why, for Artaud, plague is something which is a kind of symptom or a kind of syndrome which strikes a city, a place, in a mysterious way, but which eventually brings out its essential vulnerability, its essential fissures, its essential inconsistency, something like that. So one of the most powerful and evocative passages in Theatre and the Plague actually describes the plague. And Artaud says that during the plague, and I paraphrase by and large, during the plague, normal social order has collapsed. There is no police, no municipality, no army. Pyres are lit everywhere to burn the dead. But too little wood and space and too many corpses. And those remaining survivors, they disperse to the streets, their minds full of horrible visions. And some who have no symptoms, no rashes or any other symptoms, look at themselves feeling in splendid health, only to fall dead in front of the mirror with their shaving dishes in their hands, their faces full of scorn for the other victims and asymptomatic patients. And then something else happens. And Arthur says that at this time, the continent sodomized their kin. The obedient son kills his father. The dandy decks himself out and moves among the charnel houses. The soldier who had risked his life to save his town burns it down. And so on. So again, what we see in this syndrome of the plague is not at all an analysis of the plague, that is the origins of the plague, analysis of the origins of the plague. But what we see in this is a continuous revocation or abandoning of all the social roles, what Max Weber called vocations in modern society. The abandoning of all the vocations of modern society. And here Arthur says that what hits the town is a certain kind of pointlessness. And then he goes on to say, it is with this pointlessness that theater establishes itself. This momentary pointlessness, this brief uselessness. When everything is of use, the father of the family, the obedient son, the continence of the, the social citizen, the soldier, the patriot, the dandy, as an upper class aristocrat, all of these have uses. They are uses, social uses. When all of these uses have become, in the moment of the plague, useless, it is then that theater establishes itself. This is the most enigmatic and challenging statements if you were not to dismiss it, as a lot of people do, as simple madness. Arthur's madness, his anti-scientific hocus pocus, eventually madness. If you are not to dismiss it, then how do you go forward with this? What do you do after this? Now, it seems to me what is happening here is something to do with the temporality of the experience of the plague. What Arthur is doing is really telling us that with the plague, something ends forever, irreversibly. So the plague, in other words, is not a virus in the physical, material, virological sense, whether moving from a rat or a marmot to human beings. The plague is an event of irreversible magnitude, a kind of apocalypse. You can think of it through religious analogies, of course. A plague is where something ends forever. But at the same time, Arthur says, precisely because something ends, a whole set of new possibilities arise, which are what? Arthur gives it a very exact political name. He calls it anarchic. A new anarchy becomes possible. But what is anarchy? Anarchy is not attitude of, being irresponsible and doing nothing about whatever is going on. Anarchy is the giving up of the search of principles of origin. So anarchy is the precise rationality. So it is a rationality, but it is a rationality strictly anti-scientific insofar as science is a search for principles, which can be thought by human beings. Science is the research of principles for which human communities can take responsibility. It is to give up on this kind of search for principles, which in the Greek language is archy. And anarchy is what then? What is anarchy? In this case, the anarchy that plague makes possible. And here, Arthur seems to be saying, anarchy is the new power of combination, the new power of what Arthur in another place calls unnatural conjunctions, of contradictory ensembles, contradictory, joining together. So if something is in essence lewd, erotic, licentious, and Arthur says at the moment of a plague, the lewd become chaste. And chastity and lewdness are contradictory, and both are conjoined together. Then this is a conjunction which is unnatural, contradictory in terms of the laws of nature, the principle of nature. And where is it that unnatural conjunctions are possible? In art, in surrealist painting, in other forms of art which are treated with the work of freedom, the freedom of the artist. And at the same time, taken beyond a point, this kind of freedom is destructive, clearly. It is not only destructive, it is nihilistic, because it seems to be glorifying and praising a plague, which is causing such terrible devastation, as we know. So there is something very dangerous here, and yet something very real here. Because clearly, during a plague, during a crisis, the old principles don't hold. So it is something which becomes irreversible, something which becomes, at that time, to understand it in early 20th century context, something revolutionary that the plague signifies for Arthur. And the resonance of the other kind of revolution, the political revolution at that time, in Russia, in other places, in Europe, basically, and also anti-colonial revolts that are taking place, are all relevant here, because all of them aspire to an irreversible change of the historical course. But to do that, Arthur has to really perform this apparently absurd task, which is to refuse or refute science, the scientific principle of the material origins of a plague in the direction of a pandemic, that is an epidemic. So this is actually, let me put it schematically, this is actually a text on epidemic without epidemiological reasoning. It refers to an epidemic situation in terms of the syndrome, in terms of the actually what's happening, science. But at the same time, it is without epidemiological reasoning, or it is actually an anti-epidemiological text, because epidemiology will say that not only does epidemic spread, it spreads in a rational way, which can be verified through mathematical and statistical sciences. So actually, the big task which I cannot perform but I want to indicate today, is between early 20th century and the present. If there is a competition, or there's a kind of context, a rivalry between this vision of art, which is anarchic and revolutionary, post-plague, post-epidemic, and on the other hand, a history of epidemiological reconstruction of the epidemic through statistical and mathematical means. If there is a kind of rivalry between the two, then what is truly interesting is that in these, 70, 80, 100 years, there actually has emerged a point of unlikely commonality between these two rivals. And that is what I want to mention today. And thanks to this invitation, I was able to study this a little bit through certain texts. What is common between these two rival historical strands is the genre that both use. What is the genre that Arthur uses? Arthur is not writing a play, he is writing an essay. But he's also not writing a discursive essay, though there are extremely lucid discursive descriptions and analysis of the history of, different episodes from the plague history. But eventually this text is a text written in the mode of scenarios, mode of scenes that paint a picture, that vividly put to us a whole series of imaginary actions. The killing and the erotic and the necrophilic scandals, the transgressions, all of them are painted in terribly shocking, but also terribly fascinating pictures by Arthur, word pictures. So there are scenarios of a future which is born out of an irreversible event of the plague. And the plague itself is not just a physical event, it is, in that sense, a metaphysical opportunity for something new to take place in art, through art. He calls it the art of theater. But what is historically interesting is that exactly in the same period, even a little before when Arthur was writing, there were already the strategic discoveries of the genre of scenario in the area of securitarian thinking that was being formed, though nascently in its early stages, in certain European and Western states. So, for instance, we learn from certain anthropologists that there was someone whose social role or his professional role was that of a futurologist, a futurist, a futurologist, not a futurist merely, because futurism is also a genre of painting. A futurologist, a future sign, the science of the future, something as strange as that. A futurologist called Herman Kahn, who said that our securitarian concerns after the Second World War should be that we must prepare for the future so as to produce scenarios of the unthinkable. So now you see the word plague has gained a different meaning. Not simply the emergence of a whole set of scandals, of social anarchy, of civic pointlessness, but something which has become even more radically expressed, that the plague as civic destruction of security of not just a town, but of society, which the state is meant to protect, obviously. This irreversible end of security is impossible. It is unthinkable. The state and society are immortal. They cannot be allowed to enter this unthinkable zone of destruction, irreversible destruction, which Arthur is apparently glorifying as revolutionary. So what do you do? So here, between Herman Kahn in early 20th century, same time as Arthur is writing, to mathematicians and scientists and strategists from the 70s up to now, what we find are very interesting, but very dismal, frankly, examples of how to invent new securitarian scenarios, which are then the templates, the texts on which simulations, theatrical simulations are practiced as securitarian measures before a real event hits you, attacks you. This is taking place in Western societies largely, and it moves from Western societies to non-Western societies. And that itself is a very complicated history of something like post-colonial mimesis, post-colonial imitation. I'll very quickly explain. What is fundamentally in question here is, and this is what between Herman Kahn and a mathematician called, if I remember correctly, Robert Kuppenheim, something like that. I might be wrong with the name a little bit because I can't see very well. I can't look at the name. I think his name is Robert Kuppenheim. He's a mathematician. And he's saying that we must be able to simulate the statistically probable disasters, events of catastrophe that might strike us in the future in such a way that when they actually happen, we must be totally prepared for it. So these are also called projects of emergency preparedness. And a whole host of funding agencies, NGOs, state funding, and most importantly, international agencies get together to make these futurist scenarios possible, one of which is the World Health Organization. So the technology or the technique of the scenario oscillates, moves between the radical anti-institutional theatrical philosophy or the philosophy of theater that Arthur propagates to immunitarian texts that are texts of simulation that societies and health agencies and public health professionals must practice, must perform so as to prepare themselves for real health emergencies. Now, of course, health is not the only emergency. The leading regime of emergencies is, and you guessed it, is referred to as terrorism. The paradigm of emergency is terrorism. And so one of the scenes that is envisaged as a real threat to the future by these combination of security thinkers, strategists, and medical professionals and mathematicians, statisticians, is the scenario of bioweapons. So Kuppenheim actually fears, because he's talking at a time when in the 1990s, he's very much present, when the Iraq war is taking place, that you can have Iraqis or Iraq attacking you with a dose of smallpox, even when the World Health Organization smallpox eradication program has been extremely successful. Smallpox can come back. So through bioweapons, there can be a return of all kinds of old, apparently eradicated epidemics. But clearly, this is something which is not anymore talking in terms of irreversible world historical change. Here are scenarios of reversibility. Scenarios which must make it possible for you to imagine this unthinkable destruction of the world or destruction of security of societies, but in terms of immunitarian prescriptions to prevent that future from happening. How will that happen? Now, of course, the hard immunitarian path is vaccinology, vaccines, which is obviously nothing to do with narratives or simulation or theatrical scenarios. This is the reason why I call my talk a talk on chronicles of immunity and theater, not history. Because you see, the genre of history already demands or already possesses a certain claim to a certain scientific truth. But what you actually encounter in this entire web of documents is not at all the necessarily scientific document or the document on which science will be erected, but documents which are hybrid documents, which are fictionalized documents, which are scenarios, and hence chronicles. Tellings. What is a chronicle? It is a telling. It is an oral delivery. And this is something which actually reaches even the institutional history of scientific institutions. So when in 2020, the World Health Organization declares that we are in the midst of a coronavirus, COVID-19, SARS coronavirus 2 pandemic, then it is a declaration. It is what linguists call a performative declaration. By such a declaration, we are now, each of us in the world, prescribed to adapt to that declaration in such a way that our dispositions, our bodily behaviors, our social interactions, all of them are to be modified. But the origin of this is a declaration. But it is not an empty declaration. It is not just a declaration. Now, again, this is a very interesting discussion on the technology of performative or linguistic declarations. If someone says from a certain position of authority that, today we are in the middle of a pandemic, or this is a pandemic, not just a localized Chinese episode, then this is to be based on a certain real material situation. It is not an empty declaration. But at the same time, it is a declaration because without it, the facts in themselves do not transparently give rise to a scientific conclusion. So this is something which is extremely important. A performative takes place at a place of a certain undecidability. There are a huge amount of scientific documents, researches, studies. There's also a certain set of hypotheses which scientists are offering. But taken all in all, they do not univocally, consensually, transparently produce a single conclusion. They produce a whole set of possibilities, but you cannot conclusively decide on this side of the truth or that. It is in such a situation that a declaration made by an institution with legitimate authority like the World Health Organization, that it produces a new effect, an irreversible effect, that from now on, a certain pandemic is what is our situation. We are, in that sense, in a pandemic. We are pandemic subjects. But you see, again, even with a performative declaration like that, a linguistic performance, things are not settled. So that's why between that period of the month of March 2020 and the present, what we see is a whole set of debates, a whole set of uncertainty. One of which is, of course, again, you guessed right, is the question of, again, the origins of the virus, whether they lie in the Chinese laboratory of Wuhan, or whether they come from the wet markets or something else, or whether, which a certain Chinese doctor who's now, of course, in America, also an immigrant in a certain sense, in fear of her life, it seems, Dr. Li Meng has asserted, is a case of developing bioweapons. Now, each of these possibilities have been, again, circulated in new chronicles. And today, in the age of the media, social media, the circulation of chronicles, it is very difficult to distinguish between one type of circulation or one genre and another genre of circulation. Which is the circulation which is a narrative telling of a certain fictionalized tales, and which is the telling, which is the telling of what is called in pious tones sometimes of the media, listen to science, what science is telling. But actually, in effect, because of the nature of our media, it is difficult to distinguish between what is told as a so-called listening to authority and what is told as a so-called play of the media itself, the combinations of the media. So you see something ironic, if not caricatural, is happening. It is exactly when we wonder what Arthur meant by the new combinations possible during a pandemic, during a plague, when all contradictory and unnatural conjunctions seem anarchically possible in the performance of the theater of the real in this case, not necessarily a play. It is exactly then that with the pandemic of the present times and its correlation with the digital world, that
we see exactly such combinations possible. All combinations and more. Unthinkable, impossible combinations are possible digitally. Now, this is something which actually does not merely emerge so empirically, so clearly in our times, in the last 2 years, when everything from education to art is now thought of digitally. This is already there in the immunitarian, securitarian history that I was briefly narrating to you. Because where is it that simulations for emergencies, health emergencies, can be exercised, performed with the greatest freedom, with the most unlikely but terrible eventuality to be imagined, in the digital form, on a computer, on a flat screen, not only through three-dimensional theatrical exercises, which were happening in any case. The military from America to Israel was always experimenting with, Tracy Davis, the great historian of theater, has referred to this. In defense exercises, theater was being constantly used as simulation. But at the same time, it is with the emergence of digital technology, much before the present pandemic, that these very efforts, projects of simulation, were now carried out at a global scale beyond the limits of national territories, which were a kind of theater of the nation, where mostly these simulations were held. For instance, some of the simulations that were held with a thought of possible entry of colonial diseases, colonial epidemics back into the West, in America, for instance, in the US, including the smallpox. And it is when such a threat strikes you that America wants to, American agencies, whether securitarian agencies, NGOs, or other agencies, medical authorities, they want to create simulations which help them to prepare at the hospital, at the civic level, on the different parts of the city where you have to prepare for such an eventuality, where the scenes are pretty close to what Arthur said. So this is the point. The scenario is not so different from what Arthur said. When people are running around with horrible visions, when people are falling dead who are asymptomatic, hospitals are overrun, and God, the scenario of the funeral pyres, and not even that. All of that is there in the securitarian scenario, with the difference that all of this is sought to be reversed, to be immunized, to be protected. But you see, while all of this is happening, there is also the epidemiological reasoning which tells every national territory that its territory is not the limits of the pandemic or the epidemic. A global pandemic spreads because it does not respect territories. And so the global simulation exercise already is digitally determined. You cannot have a global territorial simulation. It can only be done on a computer. This is something which anthropologists have already shown much before, at least sometime before the pandemic of 2020 hit us. Only thing was that it was happening from the side of the immunitarian, securitarian world or apparatuses. What happened with the real event of 2020 was we saw that how these immunitarian, securitarian apparatuses apparently were of no help. They did not prevent us from undergoing terrible suffering, whether that be with the European Western countries in the first phase, and second in those parts of the world, and the second wave in a society, a so-called Eastern society like India. Now, I don't think I can carry on for too long, because otherwise I'll both go over my, my prescribed time, and also bore you, which I do not want to do. Nevertheless, I will take, I think, 15 minutes to finish. Now, what is interesting is that in the first part of the 2020 epidemic, declared to be pandemic by the World Health Organization, there was a certain asymmetry in the way it spread. And clearly, global capitalist societies like European and American societies, where there was far more circulation of commodities and human beings, carried the virus as part of the circuit. So there was far more infections and hence deaths, but also the demand for new immunitarian measures was felt more urgently at that time there. So one of the immunitarian measures that was, now it seems such a banal chronicle, but such a crucial one, but it was a chronicle of certain undecidable, to's and fro's, going forward and 2 steps backwards, with the question of the mask, if not the eventual measure of social distancing. At that time, no one thought that these were truly immunitarian. They thought these were intermediate social measures to protect oneself. But the strong sense of immunity, as what? What is the strong sense of immunity? It is sovereignty. The strong sense of immunity is that something which is immune is sovereign. It is by its very constitution protected from anything which is outside itself, a pathogen, a threat, a terrorist attack, anything. It is truly sovereign. But what is significant is that, if not, completely paradoxical, is that exactly when a history of sovereign exercises by states and powers and authorities starts, sovereignty becomes falsified. Why do we need sovereign exercise of the police, military, whatever else, civic defense, if there is sovereignty? Precisely because there is no consistent sovereignty, we need sovereign exercise of power. Police and military show that there is no consistent sovereignty. In the same way, immunitarian history shows there is no immunity in a substantive sense, in a true essential sense. That is why the only meaning that we attached to immunity at that time in the early part was vaccine, the vaccine to come. Now, one of the failures that I understand now when I read these chronicles and documents is that there were already a lot of vaccinological experiments along with the simulation experiments that were taking place over the last 100 years at least. But with the coronavirus 2, that is the SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, 2019, this particular, sorry, not 2019, COVID-19 in 2020 declared to be such. COVID-19 is that no true vaccinological or vaccine was prepared. It was not possible to have actually predicted the nature of this virus. And that is why the Chinese controversy arose. And that is why today, the latest chronicle that I read from the magazine called The Week is by an Indian, a mysterious Indian called the Seeker, who has brought out a very lucid and an extraordinary document on all the possible scenarios that took place from 2013 or 14 up to 2020 at Wuhan or in China, which leads to one of the possible theories of origin that it took place, the COVID-19 origin was in the laboratory, but though it was not a consciously lab-made virus, because that is scientifically extremely unlikely, but it is something which was collected in a zoonotic transmission from bats at a particular mine, collected and curated at the Wuhan laboratory but was leaked, not deliberately, accidentally, as a possible hypothesis, a scenario. But what was the reason for this frenetic activity of collection, of scientific research, of valid scientific research? What was the motivation? Here, the Indian seeker, this brilliant seeker, is inadequate in his understanding. I'm told it's a he, but it doesn't matter. I'm told this, the seeker, through the computer and other means, did extraordinary work in collecting and putting them together in an extremely coherent picture. But his main complaint is that if the Chinese were undertaking such frantic research and collecting so many samples of viruses, and some of them were leaked, then this fact should be highlighted, if it is a fact, or at least it should be investigated, which the WHO is not doing sufficiently. But the real question is that this is not the only lab in which this was happening. It was in any case part of a global American-funded project. The name of the project was interesting. It was predict, to predict the next viral disaster, the viral epidemic, which evidently failed. But while all of this is happening, the real diagnosis at the level of global capitalism is that all of this is to be able to produce from the side of the pharmaceutical industry and other kinds of securitarian points of authority, scientific and political authority, vaccines, not just to protect the population, but also to market it. In the document that the seeker excavated, he found at a certain place a Chinese phrase from the Chinese documents, which said, we must industrialize the results of the laboratory. And the seeker mockingly asks, imagine that, industrialize these results. What is going on? But that is exactly what capitalism is doing everywhere. All of these hard immunitarian and soft immunitarian measures, even if ending up in total failure, are precisely to industrialize these results. So this is the historical being that we are. That as we create more and more scenarios of the future, so as to be able to think the unthinkable of disasters, medical emergencies, widespread spread death, by the very nature of this frantic immunitarian pursuit, we create the conditions for a lab leak that might or might not have taken place in Wuhan. This is the central, it seems to me, and delicate and shattering paradox, which the seeker was not interested in seeking. Otherwise, he's more clever than I am. But what happened in 2020 is interesting, because the Western part of the world, which felt the earliest need for measures which were not thought of in terms of hard immunitarian vaccinological measures at all, but in terms of social measures, like the mask. The mask, it took a long time to settle down with the mask and social distancing eventually, which produced tremendous resistance among individualist societies, let me put it this way. But what was interesting was, because of the need felt in these societies for consistent discipline among so-called individualist free societies, and seeing that in certain so-called Eastern societies, like at that time South Korea, Singapore maybe, there was far greater epidemiological success in being able to stop the spread of the virus, and far greater discipline among the population in wearing masks and maintaining distance. I heard in one, I think, CNN program, when someone said, one scientifically minded, if not a scientist, a Western commentator said, look east, they have discipline, we don't. Now, this was interesting because this was a return to a colonial understanding of Eastern societies, not based on freedom, but based on something like ritual discipline, automatic discipline, unthinking discipline, total discipline. While it is the West which takes the risk of freedom and responsibility, and hence also commits sometimes the gravest errors of judgment. that at that time, because of the risk of life, this, this heartfelt, anguished voice of the Western commentator looked to the East, or heard the East follow orders far more rigorously. So rigor became a measure of Eastern discipline, and freedom became a measure of Western errancy, Western error. It is again in the history of theater that we find the same post-colonial equivocation in the period between Arto in the 30s to the 60s and maybe up to the 70s and even early 80s, when a whole lot of Western theater actors, directors, and scholars came to the different Eastern societies, including to India, and suggested that we learn from these societies their performance traditions, which are based on the rigors of the body and not on psychological freedom of the actor. Not on society as it is lived normally in normal times, bourgeois drama, for instance, including the drama of probably Chekhov and Ibsen, great as they were. But something which had roots, so it was also called Theatre of the Roots Project, roots in something beyond contingent authorship, beyond individual character. So epics. So chronicles and narratives rather than playtexts. And eventually, traditions of performance which were learned from generation to generation, transmitted as if, again, as a chronicle of tradition rather than as a school of acting. I don't have to go into detail about this, but what is interesting is this is an exact analogy to the same lament of lacking rigor and depending too much on freedom that was lamented in the history of theater, but with a big qualification. One of the pioneers of this theater search, the seeker, again a seeker in the theater, Jerzy Grotowski, in his own work, always refused to give up on the idea of freedom, on the principle of freedom. And in that sense, he was, just as a passing reference, he was opposed to the fetishization of the yoga as a training method for the actors, particularly the yogic idea of meditation. Because he felt meditation took you inside yourself, while theater must be based on the encounter with the other, with other actors, with other bodies. Yoga was actually far more individualistic, while theater was social. So on the one hand, he wanted to retain the idea of freedom as intrinsic to society. And at the same time, Jerzy Grotowski wanted the rigor of Eastern traditions as something pedagogical, something which is exercise, something which is simulation. So not anymore theater that actually existed in these societies, but theater which became a simulacrum of the possibilities of theater as a combination that eventually in digital theater would become something anonymous. It doesn't matter if something comes from Kudiyattam or comes from medieval Italian commedia dell'arte tradition. They're all positions of the body, which in a kind of digital morphology can be combined and recombined with each other as images. So already a certain vision of the simulacrum of the East was being imported into the erstwhile colonizing contexts as Western societies, but in the sphere of theater. This contradiction of mimicry and a strange sort of glorification of colonized societies is seen again in the last 1 year. But all of this is only temporary, and that is my last point. Because Eastern societies in themselves, given the kind of viral trajectories from mutations and new variants, are not in themselves a consistent whole, which by 2021, April and May became clearly visible in India. When India, which had a far better record till then, suddenly entered what was called the second wave or the second surge, And what we saw was almost visibly the return of the plague. The plague in the sense of the scenario of horrible visions of bodies being burnt or even not being able to be burnt, of a crisis of space, of a mixing up of stratified, classes. So where upper classes themselves till then were relatively protected from the virus, relatively, but suddenly exposed to something which was a lack of oxygen. Arthur had said that rich and the poor are, these segregations will break down in the plague. And at that time, it was almost an idealistic statement. But this was something partly being experienced in the situation that we saw at a couple of months back. And by which time the soft immunitarian measures were now actually being clubbed with the hard immunitarian measures like the vaccines as being all called immunitarian. So now doctors came on and said that social distancing and masks were the most important immunitarian measures. Vaccines were only a supplement or a complement. An addition, a reversal from 2020 to 2021. Because of this kind of heterogeneous combination of the plague and the pandemic, because it cannot be a plague in the pure theatrical sense. Because the real of the plague is that it is plugged into a global system, which is a medical, public health, and private pharmaceutical world of capitalization. Both. You cannot unplug it and put it into a pure raw scene of the plague. But at the same time, the experience is as if measurable only through a primitive plague and not a modern pandemic. So finally, it is in this kind of a paradoxical, contradictory context that one asks that if theater has been instrumentalized by the state, and even that instrumentality has failed, and theater in the Arthurian sense of an irreversible, revolutionary imagination of the plague is anti-scientific, dangerous, and eventually mad, then is art, is theater to be, for the moment at least, to be forgotten, to be, put to the side while we deal with the reality of the biological crisis? Is that for the moment a suspension of art and theater? It is. I mean, no one can deny it. In some essential sense, it is. No one can deny it. Irrespective of whatever residual works of art we make, or even the sort of compensatory art that we make, in the sense that we produce songs in honor of those who die, or who, the doctors and the nurses who fight our cause in the hospitals and so on and so forth. Irrespective of those marginal works, as such as fundamental civic activities, the activity which defines a place like Athens or a place like Pune, is that to be momentarily forgotten? I can only answer factually. And the answer is, but it is not forgotten. As a teacher of theater, I read, papers written even today, despite all the difficulties of digital education, sent to me or read out to me because of my own problems. And I find, for instance, I thank my student Nimish from IIT Delhi, who writes in one of his papers on digital theater that today the digital theater is a minimal theater, and yet it is a theater which is the only theater. But it is a minimal theater even technologically, even artist in terms of form. While we thought that digital technology as new media is an advance on earlier, more physical forms of artistic communication. Why? Because my student Nimish points out to me that it is exactly when we are making digital performances, we must make the performance, particularly in a place like India, where technology is so unequal in terms of access to technology, we must make performances for the least advanced digital device, the least advanced phone, not the best computer, but the crudest smartphone. At the least power of accessing, getting access to a network, to clarity, and so on and so forth. In these conditions, which is the performance, work as work, that is tenable? It is clearly, and that is what something, that is something which, empirically we can see, it is only the work of speech, not the work of the image, not the work which digital media as simulation is already so celebrated for. But actually digital medium becomes the articulation of a minimal desire which is located in something primitive, which is speech. So most of the performances today are speech-centered. Because even if you can't see clearly, you can at the most hear a story, hear a chronicle, listen to a particular scene, even if you can't see it on your device. You can make some minimal sense and, so to speak, aesthetically enjoy the performance. So it is the return to a minimal condition which expresses not at all a new genre of theater, a new great horizon of art, which is digital art, but something minimal and universal, which is the desire for art as such in any condition. In any condition means minimal conditions. But minimal condition means the condition that is available, which is digital. That doesn't make it digital art. It makes it art in its minimal universal articulation. So it seems to me that this kind of art or this kind of theater should not be measured by its empirical value as genre or work or stylistic features or any of that. It should be measured by something which is desire, which is universal, but which exists even at the time of its greatest crisis. And so it should be measured by the minimal but true existence of other such universal desires. So I can think of one minimal universal desire at the time of today's crisis, which exists and entirely exists, and yet which is suspended in that very existence. And that is the desire for politics. But about politics, we'll have to meet another day. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
I thank Professor Soumyabrata Chaudhary for this fascinating lecture, for this minimal and universal articulation of the desire to connect, the desire which informed organizing this lecture series. And this is the 8th year, and in which this minimal and universal articulation of this desire to traverse across various fields such as art, politics, and science, and society, and culture, and so on. So I thank you everyone for being with us and attending this lecture online. Goodbye.